You're listening to Extra Textual. This is a show where we talk about an idea, concept, theme, trend, and relate it to some kind of media like film, TV, video games, books, music, and hopefully discover something about ourselves or our culture along the way. Thanks for listening.
So I watched some of the little Vimeo videos that you sent, like about the crossing the street shot and the like sideways panning and the office shot.
Yeah.
And so one thing I was thinking about was like, are those sort of like visual storytelling elements something that, this is going to sound fairly crazy, but like if say there were like a whole bunch of planets which develop cinema, like would they all develop things similar to that because they're like just like effective perennial visual storytelling elements, or is there some unique element to them that has to do with being like, you know, that are unique to this iteration of them, like in the United States? You know, is it something that like, you know, in cinema in other countries, do they have like a different, you know, like vernacular basis for like talking about the modern in film and stuff?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think I want to say that type of shot, so say the seriality shot, where the camera is dollying, usually laterally along a row of things, just to emphasize that it's a row of things, just like a whole bunch of copies of the same thing. I want to say that's an affordance of the lateral dolly. Like it's something that the lateral dolly can do, and it can do it well. But it's not the only function that the lateral dolly can do, and it's also not the only technique that could comment on sameness. So for that reason, given those two options, I'd probably want to lean more towards, I guess I want to lean towards specificity. I mean, I think that if we're, you know, parallel universes and there were 1,000 parallel universes, probably a bunch of them have the seriality shot. But I want to say maybe not all of them would have it. So when I was writing the book and putting together the video essay, my methodology was I watched a whole lot of movies and then I grabbed a bunch of clips. So I grabbed like 5,000 clips from these 1,000 movies that I watched. And then I went through them and I tagged them on the Mac. And so one of my tags was seriality. So any time I had a shot that seemed to evoke this idea of sameness, you know, I would tag seriality. And so I found a whole bunch in classic Hollywood movies because that's what I was watching. But B, you know, there are also examples in French movies and Russian movies and Japanese movies, and you know, so you find it in a lot of different traditions. You find it in contemporary movies as well. You know, one example that comes to mind is Toy Story 2, when Buzz Lightyear has to confront the fact that he's not the only Buzz Lightyear.
Yeah.
That in a toy store there are, you know, 1,000 other Buzz Lightyears. You know, and that I think is suggesting the idea of seriality in the same way. So it is something that's going to pop up in multiple traditions. However, I do still think there's some kind of specificity to it because I think a filmmaker in, you know, 1933 might be thinking about a seriality shot that they saw in a Hollywood movie in 1932, and then that filmmaker might be thinking about a shot that they saw in a movie in 1931. So I do think there's a kind of tradition there of specific linkages between the motifs. That is more particular than the generalized affordance that the shot could be useful for evoking seriality.
Gotcha.
Well, that was a great answer. Welcome to the show. This is Eli Steenledge, and with me is
Jeremy Holiday.
And we're excited about this episode because we have another great guest joining us to talk about things that Jeremy and I really enjoy. Well, for me especially, I like camera work, so I'm excited about...
And a lens flare. He loves lens flare.
And lens flare, I do. Natural lens flare. And also, things like film noir and classic films. So we're excited to have Patrick Keating on the show. He's the professor of communication at Trinity University, where he teaches film studies and video production and has written several books, including Hollywood Lighting from the Silent Area to Film Noir, and also The Dynamic Frame, Camera Movement in Classical Hollywood, which I believe is the latest book. So welcome to the show, Patrick. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Could you tell us a little bit more about some of your interests and work that you've written about?
Yeah. So before I got my PhD in film history, I got an MFA in film production, where I focused on cinematography. And so when I switched over to doing film history, I was encouraged to focus on cinematography because I could bring that practical eye to the study of it. And I've always liked Hollywood films, so really I became, a scholar of Hollywood cinematography. I focus mostly on the classic period, so 1920s, 30s, 40s, and a little bit of the 50s. And the first book was on lighting, and then the second book was on camera movement. So that is the main thing that I study. And then I've also written a little bit about Italian neorealism, and a little bit about, a few other kinds of cinema, but mostly I work with classic Hollywood.
Very cool. Just out of personal interest, can you comment briefly on why, maybe it was practical reasons, if there was any reasons, why you kind of didn't stick with the production side as much, which it sounds like you still teach some production, but personally, do you still do production yourself or interested in that? But also I think from what I've read of your work, it does really bring an inside look at things that I usually don't hear in academics. But was there any particular reason for that sort of shift?
Yeah, I was, even when I was at USC, when I was working on the MFA, I was thinking that I missed doing film history, and I had a writing partner, and we made a thesis film that was very much informed by our scholarly interests. It was a combination of film noir, but also like a Douglas Sirk melodrama. Sort of what would happen if you took one of the crazy families from a Douglas Sirk melodrama and threw them in the middle of a mystery plot with a detective and everything. And we did some fun things. We started the movie with a 3-minute shot. We changed the color scheme for the melodramatic scenes. They were, I think, green and magenta. And then for the noirish scenes, we used a sort of much more muted palette. And it actually, it's kind of a fun movie, but completely uncommercial. And so my writing partner ended up becoming an English teacher. I became a film professor. So I did some photography for a little bit. The last thing I shot was over 10 years ago. I worked on some avant-garde films. And I don't really miss that. But lately I have been making video essays, and that's sort of been able to get some of my creative interests to be aligned with my scholarly interests.
Very cool. I did want to comment. In full disclosure, I wasn't your student when you were at the UW, but when I took my intro to film course when you were here, Rebecca, and I can't remember her last name, taught it. And she, the way the class was taught, she would use your method, which was to essentially make the whole lecture presentation in Final Cut Pro, and then make inner titles for the slides. And the quality of the class was greatly enhanced because of that. Because like most of the folks were using like PowerPoint presentations that had like video clips in them, but since like you had the method you used was like teaching with like actual films, it always meant that like we it was just it. I can see now like how your work as a cinematographer like made your the teaching that I was able to see better, which was fun. And like when I started teaching, I've taught like some film in high school. I used the same method. Like I would make, even when I was teaching public speaking here at the university, like I made like little videos essentially the same way that you did yours when you were teaching the film class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, now I use Keynote. But, and I prefer Keynote to PowerPoint, but it does. So it's kind of between the two methods. So now I use Keynote, and then when I'm done with my lectures, I export them as MP4, and then I post them online so students look at the notes afterwards.
Yeah, I've seen some professors do that. That's really handy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we wanted to kind of dive into things, and we may kind of jump around. But in general, I don't know quite how to phrase this, but you talk a lot about sort of, my impression, the origins of some of the different like camera movements and how they were used early on in film or how they developed. Would you be able to say anything generally about maybe how, from your point of view, the like new camera movements were utilized in classical films, like how filmmakers sort of discovered these techniques and how they were used? Like we were talking earlier, and there's a lot of like specific purposes for the way the camera moves, to maybe show certain things to the audience, or give them a certain feel of things. Like something done in a longer moving shot kind of gives it that immediacy, maybe that you wouldn't get by cutting, where it's kind of disjointed, where it kind of keeps everything together. But I don't know if you have any sort of general thoughts on the way filmmakers sort of developed those techniques.
Yeah, so my book, The Dynamic Frame, starts in 1924, and the reason why I picked 1924 as the starting point is because that's when Hollywood filmmakers first saw F.W. Murnau's German film, The Last Laugh. And it used to be said that The Last Laugh invented camera movement, and that's not true. There were plenty of films that used camera movement beforehand, but it used camera movement in this very distinctive way that inspired Hollywood filmmakers, including Murnau when he moved to Hollywood, to experiment much more boldly with the technique. Prior to seeing The Last Laugh, you would find camera movement in a Hollywood film, but most likely it would have been in a slapstick movie. There are lots of scenes in Buster Keaton movies and Harold Lloyd movies where the character is, on a motorcycle or on the back end of a fire truck. Right. And then the camera is on a car alongside, following along, photographing him doing this stunt. And then there were a few other uses of the camera movement, but that was sort of the most prominent one. And it almost had this kind of low status that it was associated with slapstick and wasn't used in drama. And so that was one of the reasons why The Last Laugh was so striking, was because it used it for drama, and it used it to enhance the drama, specifically to get us to feel the emotions of the character. And so the word that I use to describe this, and it's not my word, it's Jean Mitry's word, is semi-subjective. And so what I mean by that is that the camera is photographing a character. So the camera is not looking through the character's eyes. So it's not literally a subjective shot. But the way it's photographing the character in some way evokes how the character is feeling. And the classic example in The Last Laugh is a scene where the porter, the main character, is drunk, and they get a shot where he appears to be seated and the room appears to be spinning around him. And basically they put him on like a pedestal that rotated, and the camera was also on the pedestal, and the pedestal was rotating, so it made it seem like he was stationary and the world was spinning. So there again, it's not literally a point of view shot. We're not looking through his eyes, but it expresses his subjective state of drunkenness. And I think that a lot of many of the most interesting films that I look at will use a technique in that way, evoking a character's emotions through movement.
Well,
And then there's a whole second family of usages, and I call them revelation, concealment, emphasis, and understatement. So the camera, by moving, can reveal a fact that we didn't know before, and possibly the character doesn't know.
Mm-hmm.
Or conceal a fact that maybe the character does know, but we don't. Or it can emphasize something, so something that we already know, but the camera, by dollying in, can say this is important. And then the fourth one, understatement, is sort of for a scene where we might expect there to be emphasis, but maybe the camera doesn't quite move in the way we expect it. And so it actually tries to underplay, maybe de-dramatize the scene a little bit. So that's another family of functions that filmmakers used it for.
Well, it's interesting. I think about this like idea of semi-subjective, and I think about like one of my favorite shots in a recent film. It's in the Children of Men.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and it's like it happens midway through. There's like an attack going on.
Car.
Yeah, and he's like running, and he gets to this bus. And it's a follow shot, and there ends up being like some blood splattered on the camera. And I remember watching it and thinking like, that's absurd. Like, like the blood is on the camera, emphasizing the fact to me that there's a camera there, and yet it didn't have that cinematic effect. Like the effect was like, I feel very, very, very much invested in what this character is doing at this very moment. And I mean, I guess like I just didn't have the language of semi-subjective before this point in my life to talk about it, but I think it really makes a lot of sense, and I can really see that in a lot of things, like because it's not. It is a blend of, because it's not a point of view shot. Like we're not identifying with the motion of the camera as our own motion, but where the person in the shot is shot in a way that helps us, more deeply feel or experience what they're experiencing.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that I know the shot that you're talking about. Yeah, it's one of those effects that if you pause and think about it, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but on that expressive level, I think it works incredibly well. Yeah. And it goes back to much older films. So one of the cinematographers I write about, James Wong Howe, when he was photographing fictionalized war films during World War II, such as Air Force, he like innovated this technique where whenever a bomb would go off, the camera would shake. And it's very similar because there's not supposed to be a camera in this space.
Right.
So why would it be shaking? And yet it does have that semi-subjective effect of expressing what it feels like to be in that space.
That's sort of interesting. I'm wondering if you have any concept of the reaction audiences might have had to some of these unique camera movements when they were first happening. I just think, like when I was in film school and watched some of these older films, and even, back in junior high when I discovered, Citizen Kane and started watching Orson Welles films, I was so surprised at, his unique camera angles and camera movement. I know you talk about the opening shot of Touch of Evil in your book and things like that, and how amazing it is. But do you think a lot of times, classical cinematography was meant to be sort of hidden? We talk a lot of this, so the audience wouldn't really notice, that you are watching a film. It wouldn't draw attention to itself. But like the shot you're talking about, this sort of semi-subjective, do you think audiences were surprised when they saw that, or it did seem very natural to them to be able to drawn into that?
Yeah. So I don't study audiences at all directly.
Sure.
I mostly study filmmakers.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I'll look at reviews reacting to film. So those are two maybe indirect ways of getting at audience responses.
Yeah.
And then there's maybe some archival information about what filmmakers thought the audiences were going to be responding to.
Yeah.
I do sense that in the early 20s or in the mid 20s, when filmmakers started to experiment with camera movement, there was briefly like a bit of popularity to these movies that used it boldly, but very quickly, even as early as 1926, there are magazine articles criticizing camera movement as a fad, as something that is distracting from the story. So it really only had like a year or two of popularity before people thought that it was a distraction. And certainly there were many filmmakers who would criticize the technique. I know Darryl F. Zanuck would try and get the filmmakers who worked for him. He was the head of production at 20th Century Fox. He would try and get them to use the moving camera less. And I've seen memos written by Zanuck saying, audiences don't notice it. So stop wasting my money with these elaborate dolly shots because it's not going to make me any more money if you do it. However, it's significant that he kept having to write this memo.
Yeah.
Filmmakers kept doing it. Yeah.
The filmmakers clearly did find it valuable. And I think they would have argued that even if audiences don't notice it, it's still helping to tell the story, and so it's still going to be worth pursuing.
Well, because you talk about. I admit I haven't read all of the dynamic frame, but you talk about like filmmaking as an art of revealing. And one of the things that I think about, when I was a graduate student, I took like a couple classes on like city architecture. It was particularly some cities in Europe and some cities in Asia, but a lot of the cities were organized so that when great buildings were made or great promenades were made, they were designed to sort of carry a person through the space, classic examples in Athens. Like as you move in this classical progression that was done during certain rituals, you encounter progressive things, and you eventually get closer to the heart of the city. So the way that it's revealed, and it's interesting to see like times when. When the camera moves, and as it moves through space, it also reveals progressively more information about it. Not just as if we move closer to finding what's going on in there, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, and I was particularly interested in scenes where the camera will reveal something often that a character hasn't noticed.
Yeah.
Because when we think of Hollywood films, I think there are many films where the camera is encouraging you to identify with a particular character, and so its movements tend to track pretty closely with what a character does. And in fact, there are some scholars who say that one of the key rules of Hollywood cinema is that when you move the camera, you should always follow a character's movement. And that's both to keep it character-centered, but also to keep the movement invisible. And I found in my research that there are actually plenty of times when the camera moves not to follow a character's movement. And probably the most common case is when it's revealing what a character doesn't know. And it's almost like those are cases where they do want you to notice the camera movement, precisely so you'll be thinking, okay, they're showing me what this person isn't actually seeing. I'm getting this privileged piece of information, this key fact that they don't have. I'm trying to think of an example. I think I don't even mention this example in the book. I saw it again recently. It's from the 1939 version of Goodbye, Mr. Chips. And as I recall what the shot is, so Mr. Chips has just met and fallen in love with the Greer Garson character, but they're not a couple yet. They've really just kind of met. And then I think the shot is on a boat, and it's on Mr. Chips, and he's thinking fondly of the Greer Garson character. And then the camera dollies away from him all the way down the boat to locate the Greer Garson character, and she's thinking of him. So it's you would call it an unmotivated camera movement, unmotivated in the sense that it's not following any character's movement. But of course, it's highly motivated because it's giving us privileged information, which is that both of these characters are in love with each other, even though they don't know that they're in love with each other.
From studying all this and like looking at some of those original intentions in camera movement, how do you feel about sort of modern films that it's become so common, whether we think from like music videos in the 90s, with lots of cutting, lots of movement, let's say Michael Bay, which I don't think that we necessarily have to defend as a great filmmaker, but that...
No, I will defend The Rock as a great film.
The Rock is a great film.
It's pretty great. I agree.
Yeah.
That he's sort of almost constantly moving the camera. And I think even when I taught film that, I would use that concept of, Jeremy just brought it up that Orson Welles talked about, that camera movement should always have a purpose, and I would tell my students that, like, don't move the camera unless you have a reason to do it. Don't just try to be cool because you're moving the camera to look awesome. But do you think that is overused these days, that it's not used with intentionality for the most part in kind of mainstream films?
Yeah, I think I like camera movement, so
you don't mind it too much, yeah.
The more, the better.
Okay.
But I mean, certainly, certainly Michael Bay would be an example of someone who can sometimes use it excessively. And in fact, I think this week, actually, in my international cinema class, I'm going to be talking about Hong Kong action movies from the 80s and 90s, and I'll be praising how they stage their action scenes. And just to make a comparison, I'll be presenting Michael Bay as like, here's the bad example. I'll probably be over exaggerating because, as I say, I do like some of his films.
Yeah. So like John Woo, you'll be talking about, and people like that.
Yeah, John Woo. I have an example from a Johnny Doe film, Mission. There's an amazing action scene. It's in, I think it's kind of like in a mall, like late at night, just sort of an abandoned mall, staged around these two escalators, and it's just an amazing scene. And there's very little camera movement, and what camera movement there is incredibly purposeful. And then Michael Bay, just to add some energy, likes to just shake the camera up and down.
Right.
Even during a car chase, like sometimes the cars won't even be moving, but he'll create the impression that they're moving just because the camera is like zooming in, zooming out, and it's bumping up and down the whole time. So there are some action films that I think overdo camera movement, particularly I think handheld camera movement. And I'm an admirer of Christopher Nolan films, but not an admirer of his action scenes, which often seem to be staged kind of clunkily. Yeah. And there's just a lot of bumpy camera movement, which gives you the impression of movement. Impression of action. Another genre that I think suffers nowadays is the musical, like you mentioned, the music video, and I remember when I watched Glee, and I liked Glee a lot, and I liked a lot of the singing. I thought a lot of it was great, but then the dancing, it would just be all cut up.
All cut, yeah.
Most of the cast members I don't think were professional dancers, but a couple of them were. But even the ones who were good dancers, you couldn't really appreciate them because there was too much editing and too much camera movement. And then if you compare that to a Fred Astaire number or a Gene Kelly number, where the dance unfolds in a long take and the camera is moving, but moving modestly to follow the dancer's movements, I just find that so much more satisfying than the dance numbers in Glee and any number of other contemporary Hollywood musicals.
Yeah, I would say that's one thing. I'm generally not a musical fan, but I think La La Land was, of course, looking back to lots of classical aspects of musicals, but, you know, like the opening long take that we see on the freeway, and then even the use of, you know, sort of the whip pans to kind of keep the scene together, to give that feeling that this is all happening at once, between the music and the dancing and everything. I really enjoyed that aspect of it.
Yeah, and the dance with the dance at night, outside at night, that seemed like it was consciously trying to call up like dances from like the Bandwagon and so forth. Though I just going back to the question of like contemporary filmmakers using camera movement, there are also, of course, people who use it incredibly well. And you've already brought up Alfonso Cuarón, you know, and he's certainly moving the camera a lot, but everything seems to be very purposeful. Very purposeful. And I'm thinking of Children of Men, of course. Gravity. Roma is quite different. It has more understated camera movement, but some still some very impressive camera work. And I'm also a fan of his Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Which is doing a lot of interesting things with camera movement, especially like virtual camera movement in that movie.
Yeah, there's some pretty long takes that tie different details together to definitely tell the audience what's going on there. Yeah, I think I've always really enjoyed camera movement as well. And I was trying to think of this connection to, because like you said, I think even films that don't always have like the strongest purpose, I still sort of enjoy the dynamicness from your book of camera movement in general. But I really appreciate filmmakers who sort of look back in sort of a classical sense to do it. People like Scorcese or Park Chan-wook, Denis Villeneuve, and I'm a fan of M. Night Shyamalan, actually. I think at least his early films, he was very intentional about how he used his camera. I think he got sloppier in the middle of his career about how he did that. But, you know, like, for example, let's say Scorsese, and I think Spike Lee kind of used this, and I wonder if this is kind of like the semi-subjective point of view of like how they do, you know, the quick sort of push in on characters or pulling away, or Spike Lee does the sort of floating characters, you know, going towards them. And I think that does sort of put you in the head of the person, not necessarily completely subjective of what they're seeing, but, you know, what they're experiencing. And I think those things take me out enough to make me sit up and say, oh, there's something going on here, but doesn't take me out enough that I'm not connected to those characters and what's going on.
And Spike Lee has certainly turned that shot into a directorial signature. Right. I think the pleasure of watching a Spike Lee film is waiting for the Spike Lee shot. Which I think of as that shot where the camera seems attached to the figure's body. So even as they're walking in space, it looks more like they're floating in space. And I actually do think that goes back quite self-consciously to the semi-subjective shot from The Last Laugh. I think that's
the beginnings there.
the initial example of that technique. And then occasionally you see something like that in films from the 60s. There's Czechoslovakian film called The Shop on Main Street, which has a version of that shot. John Frankenheimer's Seconds has a version of that shot. I think Mean Streets by Scorcese has a version of that shot where the camera seems attached to the person's body. And then Spike Lee kind of really claims that and makes that his signature to the point that you're thinking, like, when is he going to use it? Like what's the right context in this story for that shot to appear? And it often can be very satisfying to watch it. There it is. There's the Spike Lee shot, and that seems like this crucial turning point in the story. And like in Black Klansman, it appears right at the very end as they kind of flee down the hallway. So he's used that as a signature in a way that I think the overhead angle had become a Hitchcockian signature.
Yeah.
And Scorsese had like the triple cut as his signature, where the camera's farther out, cut in. And with Spike Lee, it's that attached camera movement shot.
I was just going to make the point that noticing, and this is something I loved about, going through film school, is all the like amazing discoveries from film history. Yeah. That like the videos that you suggest we watch, which we can link to in the notes. Yeah. On Vimeo, but these clips of the moving camera from these early films. I mean, just watching them lately, I'm just blown away that they seem so sort of modern. In their usage, and to think that those things happen so early on, I think people will be really surprised about how modern they feel. I know this is a little bit later, but something like Breathless for me from Godard blew my mind in film school, because I was like, they were doing this in the 50s, this kind of all this crazy wacky stuff, and knew what it was sort of accomplishing. That just kind of opened up a whole new world for me. I was in film school.
Yeah, for me, where the dynamic frame, I can tell you the shot that led me to write the whole book. And it was the shot from the Mary Pickford film, My Best Girl, 1927, where she is walking across the street with Buddy Rogers, and they're so in love that they don't notice that the traffic is driving in front of them and driving them as they walk across the street. And I recognized it as being a motif from Sunrise, but I also recognized that it wasn't just copying the shot. It's like they were taking it and recontextualizing the shot and giving it new meaning. Whereas in Sunrise, the city is initially very threatening, and then eventually it's negotiable, but still not really a place where you can live for these characters. In My Best Girl, it feels like this perfectly balanced machine, where they just seem, almost divinely protected as walking through space. And that was really the kernel that the whole book grew out of. And it's a Mary Pickford comedy from 1927, and it has this I think really smart usage of moving camera.
So we were talking a little bit before the show, and you had said that you were possibly going to be giving a lecture on Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse.
Yes, yeah.
Which is a film that we did a show about. I mean, I really can't stop talking about how much I like it. And I also, I mean, I don't know if you listened to the show, but I also have spent a lot of time talking about how much I couldn't stand Infinity War, and I didn't have a lot of hopes for that IP. I think they had milked it so much that there was no more water left in that rock. And then, like, 3 seconds into the Spider-Verse, I was, they had me for life, essentially. And I almost couldn't believe like different studio, but that IP was going to produce something as fantastic as that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what you intend to lecture on about it.
Yeah, that one. That's a tough one. I haven't really figured it out yet. It was just kind of an initial inkling.
Or just tell me what you like about it.
Yeah, I just thought it was inventive from the first second to the last.
Mm-hmm.
I found myself engaged with the characters, and but also it was rich, is what I liked about it. It was like, I think the story was rich. There were like multiple characters with multiple arcs. And I wasn't quite sure how it was going to resolve itself. So I thought that was rich. And then visually it was extraordinarily rich. It just seemed totally packed with ideas. Yeah. And you mentioned that the IP seems like it had exhausted itself. Yeah. But yeah, that movie just seemed to completely refresh it. If I may, I do want to go back to you mentioning M. Night Shyamalan.
Oh, of course,
please.
Because I can probably say smarter things about M. Night Shyamalan than I can about Spider-Man just yet. But I totally agree. I actually think M. Night Shyamalan is a really talented filmmaker who is admittedly an up and down filmmaker. Yeah. I think his first several films are extraordinarily strong, and especially strong visually. Yeah. He uses the long take. Yeah. He uses, camera movements, but not like crazy Touch of Evil camera movements. Just a simple pan sometimes will get it done. Just a simple crane down will get it done. So I think between The Sixth Sense and Unbreakable, and I even like Signs, I think there's some extraordinary.
We disagree on that, but I'm a big fan of Signs too. I mean,
I'm totally with you The Sixth Sense blew my mind, and Unbreakable is still pretty much like one of my favorite comic book films of all time. And it was when it came out. It was, even though there's like superhero movies are exploding, but some of the like Signs was a bit too much for me to take. The Glasses of Water was just a little too much, but there was no doubt. He just seemed like someone with just buckets of skill that just got a little George Lucas-y or something, because I remember, I think I saw like Unbreakable twice in the theater. It was like I saw it with my friends, and one group of friends I saw it with another group of friends. It was like I kind of couldn't believe someone had just made something that good. The story was tight. It was fantastically visual. There was no, there was like, you can't throw anything away. I think that's the way he makes his films. Like every single piece of story and visual element has meaning and is worthwhile in the overall story.
Yeah, he's like Hitchcock in that way, I think, in those early films.
Yeah. And I also like The Village.
I do too. I'm with him up through The Village. Yeah. Yeah,
and you bring up the Hitchcock, because Hitchcock wants to scare you just like with a shower. And then there's a moment in The Village where Shyamalan scares you with red flowers.
Yeah, that's true.
It's just so amazing that he can take the most innocuous image, and by putting it in the right context, it's absolutely terrifying. And it's got Roger Deakins photography, so it's a gorgeous film. It is good, yeah. And then he went into his prolonged slump. The Following has a few really good shots in it, but is also his touch for acting completely abandoned him. I think The Last Airbender is a disaster. But he's on his way back. We rewatched Unbreakable, and we were really impressed with it. Split. It's a little trashier than I prefer, but it clearly you can see some of his talent. And actually, totally against the critics, I think Glass is great.
We haven't quite caught up with it yet.
We
we
watched
plan to.
Split together.
Yeah.
But we haven't yet seen Glass.
Yeah.
And I
Glass
was
is better than Split.
I was pleasantly. I mean, I've been off the bandwagon since Signs. The Signs and the water lady. I don't know. But when I saw Split, I was just taken with it a little bit. I mean, it was grounded in both like appropriate psychology for that situation, and Mr. McAvoy's acting was just fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like a captivating one man show. I mean, it could have been him in a box essentially, and I would have watched the entire thing. But it just went back to. I mean, it seemed very classic. I mean, like nothing was all that surprising. But I was, everything seemed to happen at either at slightly before or slightly after the time I expected it to, and so it really kept me engaged. And it made like all of the interactions between James McAvoy and his therapist like so tense. I'm like, is he gonna kill her? Is he gonna kill her now? He's not gonna kill her.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it eventually does, right? But that tension builds, both subtly and in fits and starts. And I just, it was the first film since Unbreakable that I was like, oh, like you have complete control about how I feel.
Yeah.
I remember one of the things like when I was, taking film classes, like the idea, the concept was that like how do you define a screenplay? A screenplay is a tool for manipulating the feelings of your audience. And I felt like from the beginning to the end of Split, I was like, yes, I will ride your train.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some filmmakers benefit from restrictions, and Shyamalan, in some of the early movies, he puts restrictions on himself in ways that he seems to benefit from, and those include restrictions about camera movement, that he's not going to indulge in all the pyrotechnics that a Michael Bay is going to indulge in. He's really just going to use these simpler, more purposeful movements. And then in the middle of his career, he was making big budget things, and like the 3D that was sort of added to Last Airbender, and it just feels like this is a filmmaker who needs some parameters to work within because he's creative. It actually gets his creativity going. It seems when he's working with a tighter set of limits, and I think in Glass and in Split, he's gone back to being a filmmaker who's working within limits. I think Glass, when you see it, you'll see it's it's a superhero movie that is specifically not going to have the big splashy fight scenes that we expect from Marvel superhero films.
Right.
Yeah.
And people have criticized it because the characters, it leads you to think that there's going to be a big climactic scene, in this skyscraper. And then you do get a climactic scene, but it doesn't unfold the way you expect it to unfold. It's much more understated, much more restrained. And for all that, it's so much better.
Yeah, I think I've heard in interviews as Glass was coming out that he admitted that those big budget films are not his strength.
Yeah.
Just as you're saying that he did say, I have to work on this smaller level, and it helps him tell better stories.
And I think for me, like I don't have like the breadth I think that you both have in terms of film, but there's only a couple people that I think can really handle like the total infinite possibilities of like an unfinished film. One of them, which is Baz Luhrmann, and is mainly because of like Moulin Rouge and Romeo plus Juliet. It's like you can do whatever you want. I mean, like you can make the Moulin Rouge like a giant floating, glittering, windmill, and have like people flip through it, and like it somehow he's able to manage all that. And that's also one of the things I liked about the Spider-Verse film, which we don't have to linger on, but it was like, all right, so we're going to have like 7 origin stories. We're going to have many as many versions of Spider-Man as we can cram into a film. And we're going to like have, crazy dynamic shots all over the place. It's even like, I think too about like a lot of like Yash Chopra's classic or like modern classic Hindi films where he'll have dance numbers that go from like India to Egypt to the Swiss Alps, and it's like, because you can literally move the camera anywhere. And it takes like a particular kind of imagination, I think. I mean, to be able to do that and do it well. I mean, Eli and I mean, the thing I say colloquial is like, I call it like the Green Lantern problem, because like Green Lantern as a superhero has the ability to create anything that his mind can conceive of. That's what the ring of the Lantern Corps does to him. And there have been like almost no good Green Lantern comic books, and certainly no good Green Lantern movies, because I think when you have infinite possibility, it just takes a really long time and a particular kind of talent to be able to manage that and make that well.
Yeah. Moulin Rouge, I think is, I think parts of it are a total mess.
Yeah.
But I forgive everything with the come what may at the end. Yeah, and I show that scene in class many times, and I always feel myself, on the edge of tearing up when I show it. It's like that scene always works. So the movie can be filled with mistakes and things that don't work, and I think it is filled with things that don't work, but that scene works so well that I forgive it all.
I don't know if I mean, like say the opening of Romeo and Juliet, and I don't know if you guys have seen his show, I think it's The Get Out on Netflix, that he only directed the first 2 episodes, which are definitely better than the rest. But just the way how fast he cuts, but the variety of shots he uses in his films, slow motion, fast motion, camera moving a lot. Like, I just don't know how he conceives of that and puts it together. Like, to be thoughtful enough to get all those shots and then how to combine them is always amazing for me. And also the way that he bounces back and forth and kind of pits together sort of like fun moments and very heartfelt moments, and the contrast between those I think is always really powerful in his films, that he's one of the few filmmakers that can switch between those tones so quickly, and it works for the most part.
I think one of his techniques when he's editing very, very fast, he does like to put things in the dead center of the frame, and that sort of helps, so your eye doesn't have to be searching all of really widescreen frame.
That's a good point.
And the scene I'm thinking of specifically is the in the climax of Moulin Rouge, as the Duke is walking up the center of the aisle, and he's going to kill them, and he picks up the gun and walks down. And sometimes I'll show that in class as an example of a filmmaker who's controlling exactly where your eye is looking, and it's cut really fast, but it's just center, and then right at the key moment, right before he gets punched, your eye jumps all the way to the right-hand side of the screen, and then it moves, I think, all the way to the left, and then the punch comes. So it's almost this little extra bit of energy right as that turning point hits.
Wow, that gives me even more appreciation of what he's doing.
Yeah. Take a look at the bit where where the Duke is picking up the gun and walking towards the stage.
Not to dwell on Shyamalan, but I think not just him, but this sort of classical thing of like complete control over your frame and what you're showing, and I think at one point you talk about the sort of concept of cutting in the camera with long takes, and I've always been a fan of long takes, and we've sort of touched on that. But I think sometimes, like let's say sort of at the end of the year, when sort of a lot of the films are coming out that you should pay more attention to in some ways, or at least in my life with kids now, I'm catching up with by the end of the year that I have to see these. There is a difference I see in the films that I really appreciate, and I can tell there's more care put into them, is that filmmakers are willing to stay on their shots longer, and have a little bit longer takes. And I think Shyamalan is one of those people, at least early in his career, that was not afraid to let those shots last longer. And like Paul Thomas Anderson, I think, is still really carrying that forward. in the way he makes films, that they're okay kind of letting you rest there in that moment a little bit more. And that feels sort of more classical to me, but not like dry or something. Because I think when modern films are cutting faster, they're trying to hide something, a lack of control or quality in their filmmaking, that they did, the thought that they didn't put into it. So I don't know. It's not always something. It's like I can feel it more when I'm watching it, that there's more care that went into what they're trying to show me, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah. In the book, I talk about it with 1940s cinema as examples, and so and I divide the filmmakers into three categories. Though of course there's going to be some overlapping. But you have some filmmakers who just like to shoot a lot of footage. They just want a ton of coverage. And Frank Capra and George Stevens were really the two famous examples of this. And George Stevens would just shoot so many different angles. And it wasn't, on the one hand, it's like, this is a filmmaker who doesn't have the movie in his mind when he's shooting it. But that doesn't mean he's careless. It's just he's very careful in the editing room about which of these angles will be put together to make the film. And then you've got the cutting and the camera people who make movies that do have editing. But they planned all of the cuts ahead of time. So they only shoot the footage that they need, and it can only be cut together one way. And Hitchcock liked to present himself as being the master of cutting in the camera. And there are some scholars who say that, maybe he exaggerated the extent to which he cut it. But it's usually associated with Hitchcock. And then you've got the long take filmmakers. And Wells and Weiler would be examples of that, but also Cukor, and eventually Hitchcock would experiment with long take filmmakers, and I do have a bias towards the filmmakers in category 2 and category 3. I tend to be biased towards filmmakers who have the movie in their minds, and then they shoot it, and then they cut it together, and there's the movie. But that might just be an aesthetic bias on my part. I mean, of course, Capra and Stevens made terrific films, also.
I'm really with you. I mean, I'm not an expert by any means, but from having shot some of our films, I would lean more towards I like to have it all planned in camera. And some of that more at my level is, we don't have a lot of time to get lots of coverage, or budget, to be able to do that. But even so, when I think that I'm really well planned, getting into the editing stage, there's been many times where something has to change or is sort of rebuilt, in the editing process. And sometimes with, surprisingly good results that I didn't know were there, but I've had to sort of let that concept go and be okay with. Usually I'm actually thinking like I probably didn't get it the way that it is in my head. And so I know I'm going to have to try to do some editing magic to make it work in the end. So, I try not to be too hard on that concept.
Well, and we consult with some folks about making projects. Like some people will talk to us about either making stuff for them or helping them to make stuff. And in general, Eli and I are kind of like grumpy old folks, and they're like, "That's going to be a lot of work." Are you like, because I think about it in terms of like swimming was really big at my high school, so we talked a lot about like the metaphors in swimming. So like there's like dry land work, which is, anything that's not in the pool. And there's a lot of like strength training and other sort of exercise that you do this in dry land, and then sort of swimming is sort of the wet stuff. And when I say like to folks, I'm like, the what's going to make you a good film or project or presentation is a whole lot of dry land work. Like you need to be a writer and make hard choices about what's going to be in here, what's it going to look like, and do draft after draft. So you have a plan before you sit down with your camera and do stuff. And we were just talking with this young ska punk band the other day. We're going to be making a music video for them, and we probably talked for like 2.5 hours. And they were like, yeah, we'll like shoot this, and then I'm like, yeah, no, like we need to know what do you want it to look like? Who do you want to be in the frame? Like, what story do you want to tell? What things do you want to, what emotions do you want to convey? And we can build either a storyboard or a plan out that way. But in projects like that or other projects where we've done on our own, they always turn out better when we have a really solid plan about what to have the editing plan for the camera,
right?
We of course can't usually do things like studios where like we'll just go back and shoot it again, or we'll do it in ADR, or all these other options. We have a point to shoot, so that's part of it. But I also think, I don't know, I when I sit and look at this, one standard that I use is like what are the amount of beats per shot? Like if I sit and I watch a shot, regardless of how long it is, and there's like it's really dense. There's a lot of things that happen in it. There's a lot of emotional beats that happen. Those are all taken care of well. I feel the planning. Like I feel how they orchestrated the people and work with the actors and coach them to be able to get these beats to happen in the single shot, because you have to, right? You can't. If it's a single shot, you can't go back and adjust the timing or the intonation or the angle or all that stuff in post. You're stuck with one single one. And it always stands out as being more impressive to me. But I'm a big planner, so I appreciate that element of the storytelling.
Right.
Though I'll just add, there are some great filmmakers, who cut really, really fast. Thinking, those Paul Greengrass movies. Those just seem to be like the editing of those. Can we get away with this shot if it's 22 frames?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, how about 17 frames? And they just seem like all of them are edited in some sense perfectly. Like if you took one more frame away, you'd lose it. And they're trying to get it to that absolute tightest possible form.
Yeah. I mean, certainly like when I was entering film school at the end of the 90s, that was sort of what I thought was amazing at that time.
Artsy.
It was all this new fast cutting and things like that was going into it. And then it became quite standard, once you see it in action movies everywhere, became much more normalized. But so I may be, yes, I appreciate those things now, I think, still, but I sort of have regressed into trying to be more thoughtful.
Even so, Goodfellas is one of my favorite films. It was one of the first films that I saw that had an artsy quality to it. And I love those
fast sequences.
Yes, when he's cut. The thing that I remember most, when they're in the prison and they're cooking, and there's a half second close up on them cooking garlic in the pan,
right?
Super close up.
Sizzling
that image is burned in my mind, and I didn't even at the point I didn't even know you're not supposed to break shot scale like that.
Yeah.
But there's just it was the moving to all those different pieces that. In quick succession that, I think was done to really great effect.
Yeah. I want to say that Scorcese, I've read an interview with him. I'm not certain of this, but I think I've read an interview with him where he's praising a cut in Giant, which is directed by George Stevens, where the camera is really far away and a character, I think it's Mercedes McCambridge is playing the character, is on a horse, and then she hits the horse with her spurs, and then it just cuts into this big close-up. And it breaks the rule. You're not supposed to cut that close from that far away. But it's so much more powerful because they've broken the rule. So maybe he was thinking of that when they did the garlic cut.
So sort of speaking of things like that, you've mentioned a few films along the way today, but what would be, as we sort of wrap up, like if people were to go back and see some of these techniques they might see in modern film that seem kind of normal, but see some of the origins of them or see them used really well for some of the first times, what other films would you sort of suggest that people go back and watch?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Sunrise. Sunrise influenced film style for decades. So that's one that I think is pretty extraordinary. John Ford, who later said he didn't like camera movement, early in his career was very much imitating Sunrise. So if you watch a film that he made called Four Sons, from 1928, another silent film, you'll notice that it's very much in the style of Sunrise. So certainly anything by Murnau would be worth watching if you're interested in looking at camera movement, but also for lighting. Hitchcock and Wells were two other crucial filmmakers when it comes to camera movement. I mean, Hitchcock, you can pick pretty much anything. Wells, of course, Citizen Kane, but The Magnificent Ambersons also is really remarkable. And I think there's a new criterion of The Magnificent Ambersons, I believe, that would very much be worth watching. Of course, Touch of Evil, speaking of Wells. I'm also a fan of Preminger.
Okay.
And a couple of my favorite examples from the book are from Preminger movies. I describe a 2.5-minute scene in a movie called Where the Sidewalk Ends, which I think is a pretty interesting shot. Bonjour Tristesse, also by Preminger. That would be another one worth watching. And how about some Lubitsch films?
Yeah.
One of the examples I give in the book is from Design for Living. But if I had to pick one Lubitsch film to watch, I would watch Trouble in Paradise.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Lubitsch always struck me as feeling very modern for when those films were out. I think that's a great place to start, great list to do it. And I don't know if Jeremy has any other things you want to bring up, but I know we need to bring you back to talk about noir films because we didn't get around to that. And we could probably talk about that for a while. Yeah. But I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts on that more. But
I mean, I had a sort of, with all this discussion of classical Hollywood, I had a somewhat related, somewhat off-the-wall question, which was The Shape of Water. We liked it, but I did not think it was like movie of the year like kind of film. And I often felt like there was something that I was missing. I mean, it's like cool, Russians, fish sex, all the big stuff. Because it's over a theater and because they kept going back to that sort of reference to like the classical cinema, I felt like it was like almost like it was speaking to a different generation, or it was appealing to something that that wasn't resonating with me. And I was wondering if, because you had such experience with classical cinema, it had like the kind of movie of the year resonance with you.
Yeah, I did like the film. I liked it a lot. I remember thinking about 1 minute in, this is made by a filmmaker, which I don't say about every film, even though I suppose literally it would be true. But
right.
But that one, I just said, this is made by a filmmaker. This is made by someone who's thinking about what color should the wallpaper be, should the camera be moving? If so, how fast should it be moving? What music should be playing right about now? I just felt that this was made by someone who wants to tell a story visually. The story, I did think it was delightfully weird. I must say, my tastes are rather tame. There's a reason I studied Hollywood film, so I did find the film a little R-rated for my tame taste.
Uh-huh.
But I was won over by the film when she started dancing with the fish. I think before then I said, "Oh, this is pretty good. I'm not sold on it." And when she started dancing with the fish, I said, "Yes, okay, you've got me." Yeah. So I guess I was happy that it won Best Picture, in part because I had, on a previous podcast, I had predicted that it was
nice.
So I was able to get that prediction correct. But there were other films that I was also pulling for that year.
Can I ask you a little bit about that dance, though? So when I saw it, the first film that came to my mind was Pennies from Heaven. You know,
Okay.
the like it's like a parody, and I recognize that it's like that. Pennies from Heaven is like a parody. I mean, it uses as its base, you know, this classical film kind of story, like the rags to riches story, but sort of inverts it. I was wondering if like there were other sort of classical films that sort of break out positive dance number that you think sort of comes from, or, you know, like echoes.
Yeah, I don't think I can. I don't think I can think of them off the top of my head. You know, I mentioned before a dance number from the Bandwagon.
Yeah.
And there is this. There is a wonderful scene, and I just want to confirm in my mind that I'm thinking of the right movie. But it's with Fred Astaire and Sid Charisse, and they're walking through the park, and they haven't fallen in love with each other yet, but you know they're about to. You know it's going to happen really, really soon. And then they're walking through a park, and they see a bunch of people dancing, and there's music playing and people are dancing, and you think they're going to join them, but instead they walk through the crowd and they don't start dancing yet. And then they get to an empty part of the park, and then they start dancing, and it's just wonderful. It's just beautiful. So if you ask me to think of like one, you know, incredibly romantic dance number, that's probably the first one I think of.
Nice.
Yeah.
I hope I've been accurate. Now I feel like I need to go back and like double check that I've been describing these scenes accurately and I've been naming the movies correctly. But I hope that 90% of what I've said today is accurate.
Yeah, it's all movie magic. Yeah.
Okay.
It's all about the moment that you remember. That's okay.
So thanks so much for talking with us, Patrick. We will have to have you back again because there's a lot more to talk about. But thanks for spending this hour with us.
Yeah, this was really fascinating. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you. Sorry. I can honestly say that, like, I mean, I'd read where you talk about the idea of, like, when you first introduced the idea of semi-subjective in the book, but I didn't really grasp its significance until we talked about it today. So, like, I'm like very thankful for that because it's allowing me to. It's just like a really very clear and descriptive term for a lot of experiences I've had as a film watcher that I haven't had a good good way of describing.
Yeah. And we've mentioned like Scorcese movies and Spike Lee movies, and I think they're filled with semi-subjective shots.
Nice. Thanks for talking with us.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. And
Bye.
Thanks for listening. This has been Extra Textual.